Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Sarah Thompson, and joining me today is Michael Chen.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic.
That's right, Michael. Today we're going to be discussing a landmark case in Indian legal history, the 1975 Supreme Court judgment in the case of Indira Nehru Gandhi versus Raj Narain. This case had significant implications for Indian democracy and the balance of power between different branches of government.
Absolutely, Sarah. This case is fascinating not just for its legal implications, but also for its political context. Before we dive into the details, could you give our listeners a brief overview of who the key players were?
Of course. The petitioner in this case was Indira Gandhi, who at the time was the Prime Minister of India. She was appealing a decision made by the Allahabad High Court that had invalidated her election to the Lok Sabha, which is the lower house of India's parliament.
And the respondent was Raj Narain, correct?
That's right. Raj Narain was Gandhi's political opponent who had challenged her election on grounds of corrupt practices. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer had to decide whether to grant a stay on the High Court's judgment.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with legal terminology, could you explain what a stay means in this context?
Certainly. A stay is essentially a pause button on a legal decision. When a court grants a stay, it means that the effects of a lower court's judgment are temporarily suspended while an appeal is being considered. In this case, Gandhi was asking the Supreme Court to stay the Allahabad High Court's decision that had invalidated her election.
That's a great explanation, Sarah. Now, one thing that struck me about this case was the timing. This was happening in June 1975, which was a particularly tumultuous time in Indian politics. Could you provide some context for our listeners?
Absolutely, Michael. This case was unfolding against the backdrop of significant political unrest in India. There were widespread protests against Gandhi's government, allegations of corruption, and economic challenges. In fact, just a few days after this judgment, on June 25, 1975, Gandhi declared a state of emergency in India, which suspended many civil liberties and centralized power in the executive branch.
That's crucial context, Sarah. It really underscores the high stakes of this legal decision. Now let's dive into some of the key legal issues at play. One thing that stood out to me was the discussion of corrupt practices in elections. Could you explain what that means in Indian election law?
Certainly. In Indian election law, corrupt practices refer to a range of actions that are prohibited during elections. These can include things like bribery, undue influence on voters, promoting enmity between different groups, or even more technical violations like using government resources for campaign purposes. In Gandhi's case, the High Court had found her guilty of 2 instances of corrupt practices, though the specifics weren't detailed in the Supreme Court judgment we're discussing.
Interesting. And it seems like Justice Krishna Iyer had to grapple with how serious these violations were. He mentions at one point that they might be venial deviations, minor offenses, but that the law treats all corrupt practices equally seriously when it comes to invalidating an election. That seems like a tough balance to strike.
You're absolutely right, Michael. This is a key tension in the judgment. On one hand, Justice Krishna Iyer acknowledges that the corrupt practices Gandhi was found guilty of might be relatively minor. But on the other hand, he's very clear that it's not his place, at this stage of the proceedings, to second-guess the High Court's findings or to treat some corrupt practices as less serious than others.
That makes sense. It seems like he's trying to respect the role of the High Court while also considering the broader implications of his decision. Speaking of which, can we talk about the concept of balance of convenience that comes up in the judgment? What does that mean in this context?
Great question, Michael. Balance of convenience is a legal principle that courts often consider when deciding whether to grant interim relief like a stay. Essentially, the court tries to weigh the potential harm or inconvenience to each party depending on whether the stay is granted or not.
So in this case, what factors was Justice Krishna Iyer considering in terms of balance of convenience?
Well, on Gandhi's side, there was the argument that if she had to step down as Prime Minister while the appeal was pending, it could cause significant disruption to the government. There was also the fact that the full term of the parliament was set to expire in about 6 months anyway. On the other side, there was the principle that someone found guilty of corrupt practices shouldn't continue in office, and the broader public interest in maintaining the integrity of the electoral process.
It sounds like a really delicate balancing act. And it seems like Justice Krishna Iyer was also very conscious of the limits of his role as a judge. He makes several comments about how the court can't consider political sentiments or make decisions based on what might be politically popular.
That's a great observation, Michael. This is a recurring theme in the judgment. Justice Krishna Iyer is very clear that while he's aware of the political context and the high stakes of the case, his job is to make a decision based on legal principles, not political considerations.
That must be challenging in a case with such significant political implications. Now let's talk about the actual decision Justice Krishna Iyer made. What was the outcome of this hearing?
The outcome was what we might call a compromise solution. Justice Krishna Iyer granted a conditional stay of the High Court's judgment. This meant that the operation of the High Court's decision was suspended, allowing Gandhi to remain a member of the Lok Sabha and continue as Prime Minister.
But there were conditions attached to this stay, right?
Exactly. While Gandhi could remain a member of the Lok Sabha, she was barred from participating in the proceedings of the House, voting, or drawing a salary as a member of Parliament. However, and this is crucial, these restrictions only applied to her role as a member of Parliament. The judgment explicitly stated that her rights and duties as Prime Minister were not affected.
That's a fascinating distinction. So essentially, her status as an elected representative was partially suspended, but her executive role was untouched.
That's right, Michael. It's a nuanced decision that tried to balance respect for the High Court's findings with the practical realities of governance. Justice Krishna Iyer was clearly trying to find a middle ground that would allow the government to continue functioning while the appeal was pending, without completely disregarding the serious allegations of electoral misconduct.
It's really interesting to see how the judge navigated these complex issues. Now, I'm curious about the longer-term implications of this case. How did this decision impact Indian law and politics going forward?
That's an excellent question, Michael. This case had significant implications, both legal and political. Legally, it helped establish precedents for how the Supreme Court handles appeals in election cases, particularly when it comes to granting stays. The detailed reasoning in Justice Krishna Iyer's order has been cited in many subsequent cases dealing with similar issues.
And politically?
Politically, the implications were even more far-reaching. As I mentioned earlier, just a few days after this judgment, Gandhi declared a state of emergency in India. While we can't draw a direct causal link, many historians and political analysts see this court case as one of the factors that contributed to Gandhi's decision to declare the emergency.
That's fascinating, Sarah. It really underscores how legal decisions can have profound political consequences, even when judges try to stay within the bounds of the law.
Absolutely, Michael. This case is a perfect example of the complex interplay between law and politics in a democracy. It also highlights the crucial role that courts play in mediating political disputes and upholding the rule of law, even in highly charged political environments.
Indeed. As we wrap up our discussion, what do you think are the key takeaways from this case for our listeners?
I think there are several important lessons here, Michael. First, it demonstrates the complex election law and the serious consequences that can follow from even seemingly minor violations. Second, it shows how courts have to balance multiple competing interests when making decisions in high-stakes political cases. And finally, it underscores the importance of an independent judiciary that can make decisions based on legal principles, even when faced with intense political pressure.
Those are excellent points, Sarah. I would add that this case also illustrates the importance of understanding the historical and political context when analyzing legal decisions. The judgment makes much more sense when we consider the tumultuous political situation in India at the time.
Absolutely, Michael. Legal decisions don't happen in a vacuum, and understanding the broader context is crucial for really grasping their significance. This case is a perfect example of that principle.
Well, I think that about wraps up our discussion for today. This has been a fascinating deep dive into a truly landmark case in Indian legal history.
It certainly has, Michael, and I hope our listeners have found it as interesting and enlightening as we have. Remember, everyone, that while we've tried to explain things as clearly as possible, legal issues can be complex. If you're dealing with any legal matters of your own, it's always best to consult with a qualified legal professional.
Absolutely, Sarah. And on that note, we'll sign off for today. Thanks to all our listeners for joining us for another episode of the Ask Junior Judgment Podcast. Until next time.
Goodbye, everyone, and thanks for listening.